All right, my English teacher friends, Kristian Kuhn coming at you again, affectionately known as the Bob Ross of composition. And I got a brainchild that is wicked, wicked cool. I'm very excited about this particular writing workshop. I'm very impressed with how it turned out, and I'm very eager to share it with teachers and students. It's entitled, Did Kurt Cobain Die Because He Misread a Poem? That is not my question. I'm going to unpack it in just a second. It comes from this fella, Tim Appelo. And the poem he's referring to is entitled A Young Woman, a Tree by Alicia Ostricker. It's a poem that Kurt Cobain wrote about in his journal days before he took his life. So it's very fascinating. It's not gruesome. It's not horrific. We're not going into that kind of territory here. It's a good, clean lesson. You don't need to have any trigger warnings or anything of that nature with it. And before I dive into it, please subscribe to the channel. We are growing exponentially. At last check, we were really coming close to having 20,000 subscribers, which delights me. So I just started this channel last May, and we are booming, which is really, really cool. So tell your friends, tell your colleagues, tell your students to subscribe. The channel name is Kristian Kuhn, the Bob Ross of composition. So let me unpack a couple of things and kind of explain the impetus behind this lesson and how the brainchild even was conceived. So I was reading this article called Desire to Burn. Did Kurt Cobain die because he misread a poem by Tim Appelo? And I read the article with my AP language students, and they said, let's do some poetry. Let's look at this poem. And I'm hardcore in AP Lang. I don't do any literature in AP Lang. I think that's housed exclusively for AP Lit. That's just kind of the way my district does it. And I was like, all right, well, we could do a little bit of poetry. And the poem is fascinating. It's called A Young Woman, a Tree by Alicia Ostricker. And it's really fascinating to juxtapose the poem to Appelo's article. And I did not teach the diary entry or the journal entry because it's gruesome. It's really, really bleak and sad, and it's not school appropriate. You can go online and look at it yourselves and kind of make that determination yourself. But for me personally, public school, New York State, I can't do that in my classroom. So I have links for Desire to Burn, Did Kurt Cobain Die Because He Misread a Poem by Tim Appelo in the description of the video. And I also have links for A Young Woman, a Tree by Alicia Ostricker in the description as well. So I made a prompt. It's very, very basic, and didn't want to clobber my AP Lang kids with too much literature stuff just because it's a Lang class. So it's very, very generic, and you can morph this if you're going to do this in your AP literature class. For on level, it's probably fine. So here's the prompt. On a devastating page of his journals, Kurt Cobain wrote down a poem by Alicia Ostricker entitled A Young Woman, a Tree. Tim Appelo analyzes the poem and wishes Cobain had read it differently. Based on our Plato's Plato discussion and Appelo's assessment, analyze and interpret the poem. Just like I said, very basic, very generic. But I do mention something in that prompt that you might be like, Plato's Plato discussion? What's that? So I gamify a lot of classroom discussion because I like the element of competition and collaboration. And I find that in traditional discussion paradigms and formats like the fishbowl, the Socratic seminar, the Harkness discussion, my experience is this. Certain kids tend to monopolize the conversation, and I find myself wagging wheeling too much. And this was a term that Theodore Sizer gave to me in graduate school. So teacher asks the question, one student speaks to it, it comes back to the teacher. Teacher asks question, goes to different student, back at the teacher. So it looks like a wagon wheel conceptually. And I just don't think that's an effective classroom discussion modality. So by gamifying it, we actually keep it pretty fun. fun, but the cool thing, and I'm going to show you this in just a second here, is the kids in this instance are the ones that are asking the questions. I love that, because if a kid can ask a very good, juicy, pithy question of a text, we know that they are the champ at reading comprehension, and it translates over really well into their multiple choice test taking skills. So I'll tell you how I would gamify this. So I have a tic-tac-toe piece that looks just like this graphic here, and the kids and I sit in a circle, and a kid is either an X or an O, and we just gamify it like tic-tac-toe. Correct answer gets the X or the O. Wrong answers deflects to the other team, and we just kind of go through our questions, and I'll show you those questions that the kids came up with in just a second. So you can do this with like Connect Fours, Jengas, Hungry Hippos, and just gamify it. I think it keeps things light, but it's very student-centric, and that element of collaboration and competition really gets all the kids to participate in it. It's hard to be a wallflower and blend in and not contribute to the discussion in some meaningful way. And then one of the things I do in Plato's Plato discussions is put speaking quotas to prevent the monopoly from happening, but also to prevent kids from not participating. I have quota parameters. So as I said, the name of the poem is A Young Woman, a Tree, Alicia Ostricker. It's in the description below. We read it 3 times as a class, and then as teams, the kids come up with the following questions. And I'll show you the types of questions that my students are coming up with. And these are the questions that we use to basically play the tic-tac-toe. So question 1 says, the first simile of the poem creates a juxtaposition between the young woman and the tree. How does this comparison characterize the young woman? So a student's creating that question. Again, if they can ask the question, then come in terms of analyzing it and writing about it or taking a multiple choice test about it, they're going to crush it. Number 2, based on the opening 4 stanzas, what is the central conflict of the poem? Use the text to support your answer. Bonus, can you identify the universal truth? So we just tussled with all these questions, and the kids debated. They're writing the questions, and they can debate the right or wrong answer, and I basically just play referee. Question 3, the word folly is repeated a couple of times. In repeating the singular word, what is Ostricker's? What is she underscoring? And again, kids need to make those kinds of observations when they read, and it's a fantastic observation. Question 4, if only she could is also repeated. What is the author's intent in doing this? And number 5, several of the similes link the woman's desire to things like the red tree, photons, and showers of yellow blazes. What do all of these 3 things share in common? And once again, what is the author's intent? Even go so far as to get to the construction of meaning. So my students, I'm always asking, especially when we get to the introduction of the essay in just a second, I ask the kids about authorial intent and construction of meaning. So often when we gamify our instruction, they use that language just because we're accustomed to it. Question 6. If is the most often repeated word in the poem. How does this word create meaning in the work as a whole? Number 7 says, compare and contrast the setting of each chapter. So you'll notice there's 3 chapters to the poem. What is Ostricker's intent in juxtaposing these physical places? Number 8, in the second subchapter, great emphasis is placed on the verb to know. What does the woman come to know in this chapter that she did not know in the first? Oh, great. So we get talking about transitions and all sorts of great funky stuff with this question. Number 9, note the difference in imagery between chapter 1 and chapter 2. How does this create meaning in the work as a whole? And then we'll go to number 10. I spy with my little eye a lot of light and dark imagery in chapters 1 and 2. What does light signify? And go one step further. What does dark signify? So you can see here, my kids in asking these questions are going cutthroat on this poem. And again, if you can ask the questions, you definitely can analyze and write about it very well. In the 3rd chapter, the tree is personified. Why? And why is this important? Going all the way to question number 12. As we've seen, the setting shifts in each chapter. What is significant about the setting in chapter 3? And then I got 2 more questions for you. Number 13. Let's go all in. Compare, contrast the imagery between all 3 chapters. What's the big idea? Right? So the setting shifts as well as the imagery in all 3 chapters. So kids got to pick up on that. It's very important. And then last question, the concluding image of the poem, yet again, focuses on the tree. What is the tree literally doing? And how does this correlate to the woman? What epiphany is arrived at? So once we gamify all of that, whether we're playing tic-tac-toe, Jenga, Connect 4, some Atari game, whatever, right? We've thoroughly unpacked the poem. And it's time to write the essay. So the discussion is kind of like our forerunner to the essay. So the first question we got to ask ourselves is this. So how do I write the intro? And for those of you that are familiar with my work, you know we're doing literary analysis. So we're going to invert the thesis. We're going to use my inverted thesis heuristic. Before I do, I always tote this adage around. You got to Bob Ross your instruction, right? You got to Bob Ross your composition. So what I mean by that is, teacher, get to the easel, get to the canvas, and paint with and for your students. Show them how to do this introduction. I'm going to do it in this video 3 times, and that's typically how many times I model something. I find that if I do it 3 times, kids get it, and it demystifies the process. But here's the big kicker. If you use heuristics, it tends to really solidify the kid's understanding. Bob Ross also used heuristics. He used something called the wet on wet technique every single time he did a natural landscape. And when we do literary analysis, we always invert the thesis, and then we tackle our body paragraph syllogistically, which we'll get to in just a second. But let's harken back to the prompt. There's some breaking news, some top secret news. Implicit in that prompt and all FRQ 1s and 2s for the AP Literature exam are 2 questions. What is the author's intent, and how does the author construct meaning? My introductory paragraphs call for 4 sentences. And what my students do is this for the inverted paradigm. They take 3 sentences to answer the question, what is the author's intent? And some teachers refer to that as like exigence, universal truth, universal theme. And then they take 1 sentence to get to the answer of how does the author construct meaning. And whenever you answer that question, you are getting to a thesis. The answer to that question constitutes and comprises the thesis. So it's the first 3 sentences are going to be authorial intent. The last sentence, which constitutes the thesis statement, is going to be construction of meaning. That's why we call it inverted, because you're going to end with the thesis. So let's take a look at that graphically and get a sense of what that looks like. So I often compare it to an upside down triangle, right? So you start off kind of broad, basic, universal theme, universal truth, some context background. I want to see my students sprinkle in some tier 2 level vocabulary, and what I mean by that is your average run-of-the-mill SAT level caliber words. I also want to see them cooking some sentence constructs to get their voice rhythm and flow going. So I explicitly teach Strunk & White's a text called Write It Right, and in it they have something known as rule number 18, in which they espouse the idea that there's 12 different ways to cobble together a single sentence. But going 1 step further, there's 20 ways to pattern those types. And I explicitly teach that to my kids so that they can be veritable syntactical ninjas on paper. And I have a ton of stuff in my YouTube channel if you want to backtrack and take a look at how I help students augment their vocabulary with my Word Study Academy. And then one aspect of my Nuance Academy are those sentence constructs and sentence types. And as I've already alluded to, it is going to be exactly 4 sentences long. So let's do the math. 3 plus 1, 3 authorial intent, 1 construction of meaning. Enough of me talking into the ether about this. Let's get to the hard evidence and see what it looks like on paper. I'll read this first exemplar aloud, and then I'll unpack it for you so that you can see all the bit parts in it. At birth, Each individual life is ignited with a certain spark of brilliance and limitless magnitude of possibility. But as far as the human condition places a cap on these natural endowments, one's thoughts and imagination are the only real limits. In other words, if one places their sole focus on the limitations of life, they render themselves as limited beings, and vice versa. Ostricker highlights upon these facts through the extended metaphor of a tree in peak foliage and contrasting settings between the 3 chapter breaks of the poem. So let's start at the end and identify the thesis. Do you see how you can hear the terms, devices, techniques in there? That's how you get to the thesis. So you either explicitly or implicitly get at the heart of devices, terms, techniques. So the extended metaphor is huge in this, the tree, right? And then also you got to take a look at the fact that in each chapter break you have a different contrasting setting and coinciding set of images that correlate to the setting. The first 3 sentences, I'm just hammering universal truth, right? What's the big idea? Why'd she write this? What's her exigence? What's the main thrust behind this poem? And I encapsulate all of that in those opening 3 sentences. You can see my vocab is up, but I'm not totally gooning out. So just nice words like magnitude, endowment, things like that, highlight. You don't have to overdo it. Stay in your wheelhouse, stay in your lane. And then all the sentences are varied as well. So one thing that I advise my students not to do is parallel their syntax, especially in the introduction, because it yields that dot, 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 dot rhythm. And usually that's created by stacking independent clauses upon independent clauses. So I tell my students, pay attention to the sentence you just dropped and then run like hell from that pattern for a couple of sentences. Don't come back to it for a few. And that avoids that redundancy pattern that often occurs in young and emerging writers. So let's do that again. That might be a little pie in the sky, a little wavy gravy for you. So I'll do it 3 times. And again, I'll read this one from the top and then I'll unpack it. One of life's grand paradoxes is this. Once man accepts his limited nature, whether this be in the form of human suffering or even self-fulfillment, the mere act of acceptance renders one boundless. But the more one kicks and screams against the apparent limitations of the human condition, the more limits they place upon themselves. The human endowment of free will gives each of us a fundamental choice. Are you going to choose a self-made misery or eternal happiness? Ostricker arrives at this point by contrasting the physical setting of 3 separate chapter breaks in her poem, as well as through the extended metaphor of the tree. So the last sentence is always the thesis. You see it there, focusing on metaphor and setting. First 3 sentences get to the universal truth, the universal theme, the exigence, right? So you just unpack that in 3 sentences. I'm not doing anything like super trick-rated with my sentences, but I did use a dash, right? So to achieve the voice, the rhythm, the flow. And all the sentences are varied as you go from sentence 1, 2, 3 to 4. Vocab is up. But again, I'm in my wheelhouse. I sound natural, but I sound academic, right? Because it's an academic paper. So students might be looking at this saying, I can't do that. And even teachers, you might look at it and say, my kids can't do that. Yes, you can. It just takes some practice. It's just a heuristic, right? And it's really groovy once you get it all figured out. So here it is again, 3 plus 1. 3, authorial intent, 1, construction of meaning. Life is really simple and boils down to a basic epiphany. Man, and only the individual himself, ultimately controls his fate, especially his personal happiness and sense of internal fulfillment. As such, one must recognize the fact that energy begets energy. It's the natural law of the natural world. If one chooses to place their focus on the bad things of life, they will cultivate their own misery. And on the flip side, if one chooses to place their focus on happy, they will reap a joyful life. Ostricker underscores this fact by juxtaposing the physical setting in 3 contrasting subchapters and through the extended metaphor of the foliage tree. And again, same terms. I mean, those terms are essential. And that's what I tell my students is, as they practice their reads of poetry, or even if we're doing rhetorical analysis, you really got to highlight the germane, relevant, like most pertinent terms, devices, techniques in that thesis statement, but you don't want to, you want to avoid doing a literary terms dumping ground. So I have my students focus on 2 typically. If it's a really juicy piece, then maybe 3, but no more than that. All right, if you're painting along with me, let's pause here, give it a whirl. 3 + 1, let's see what you got. Moving on, because we still got a whole bunch of canvas left. How do I write the body paragraphs is the next question, right? Because we're done with the intro. And the answer is easy. You're going to proceed syllogistically. Well, what is that all about? The syllogism is an Aristotelian construct. It comes from Aristotle. He ran a school called the Lyceum, and the townsboys would go there to learn about polemics, oration, debate, wordsmithing, word wrangling. And they'd often throw out and tussle these big questions like, what is justice? Which you might, students in college read Plato's Republic. That's the essential question of that text. So these philosophical think takers would step to the proverbial mic and they would drop their definition of what justice is. And Aristotle said, some of my students are really, really good at this. What are they doing? Like, they seem to have a mathematical, like, calculative precision to how they structure and lay down their arguments. And one day he had a eureka moment. He said, aha, they're thinking and articulating syllogistically. And what he meant by that was they're going premise, premise, conclusion. So let me give you an example. If I were to say premise 1, arsenic is deadly, you would all nod your head and say, yeah, Kristian, that makes total sense. That's perfectly clear. If I follow it up with a second premise that states, my dog ate arsenic, you're naturally going to conclude, uh-oh, Kristian, that's not going to bode well for your dog. Your dog's going to die. And Aristotle would call that a cogent argument, right? So we in composition refer to that as line of reasoning. So let's talk about how we take Aristotle's heuristic for oration and turn it into a heuristic for performing literary analysis. Here it is. First premise is going to be an argument containing terms, devices, techniques. Here's the kicker and how I differentiate this for kids. If you explicitly stated the term in the intro, you probably want to imply it in the first premise and vice versa. You don't want to be redundant. You don't want to repeat things over and over again because you preclude yourself from the sophistication point when you do that. And it's not good writing. So if you imply it up top, go explicit in the first and vice versa. That move's going to take 3 sentences because I want to keep the centrality of the argument. If a kid starts quoting, in sentence 1, 2, and 3, typically they're going to break the kind of the rhetorical mode or the expository mode, and it becomes plot summary, plot synopsis, plot analysis instead of literary analysis. So to really ensure that the argument stays central, I like 3 sentences, and I'll model how to do that in a second. 4th sentence begins the second premise, and that's where the textual support comes in. So a nice teeter-totter blend of quoting and paraphrasing, and then we got to have a reminder here. Body paragraphs need conclusions. You just can't drop a quote and run like hell and get out of there. You got to wrap it all back to the prompt and the thesis. So how many sentences does this take? Because it sounds like there's a lot of stuff going on in a body paragraph. Yes. And this is why I don't have my students write those 4 or 5 sentence bagger paragraphs. There's not enough going in there to really advance an argument and flesh it out. So my students will write syllogistic body paragraphs of about 10 to 12 sentences. And then in the total essay, they're going to do an intro, 2 bodies, and a conclusion. My students uniformly do that for AP Lang and AP Lit. So let's talk about that first premise. What's it look like? What's it look like on paper? So here is an example. Now, one question students ask, and it's a very good question, is where do I begin? And my question is, start where the poet begins and indicate to your reader that you have a chronology, that you have a sequence. So I'm not big on sentence stems, but students that need them, I give them 4 words, and they are as follows. right from the onset, comma. It cues the reader into knowing that you're going to have a chronological, like methodological approach through your analysis. And you're going to begin where the author begins, right? And then you just sort of methodically move your way through the poem. So let's see what I have going on here. Right from the onset, the central thematic crux is introduced. The fact that human life is capped as far as the realm of possibilities go. Juxtaposing a lurid autumn tree to the desire to break through these bonds, the narrator tries to come to terms with her apparent smallness. Through retrospection, she realizes that the human impulse to transcend man's natural limitations is foolish and in vain. So you can see in my introductions and even my first premise, I like to do a little bit of implicit, explicit as far as the terms, devices, techniques go. And when my students get to the end of a first premise, I ask them this. What's the promise of the first premise? What quotes and or paraphrases must you use, all right, in the second premise? So we got thematic crux, right? So we're going to go universal theme. We got juxtaposition in here. And we also got the metaphor that we're going to be focusing on. So I need quotes and or paraphrases for all of that, which takes me to my next point. At the end of the first premise, my students go textual support hunting, right? Get your quotes, get your paraphrases for everything that you need, and make sure you're keeping the promise of the first premise. And if you do that, you should sustain a really cogent line of reasoning. So keep that promise in mind of my first premise, and let's jump to the second premise and see what goes on there. So this is the biggest part of the syllogism. So see where I go. Immediately, the narrator grapples with the fact that sometimes life spills over some days, plus the fact that there is a God-given impulse that wishes she could explode like the fiery profusion of the natural world. So fourth sentence, I usually start quoting. And I did something kind of interesting here that I want to point out because it's sort of sophisticated. One is the quotes are smooth. And I have a heuristic within the heuristic for that. And I call it the 5-word rule. If a student uses a minimum of 5 words and keeps the quote relatively small, it should sound conversational. But here's something that I explicitly teach my students to do. Not every time they quote, but every now and then it's nice to see. There's 2 quotes in one sentence. And I know that teachers often talk about the sophistication point. I think this is just one of those little added nuance things that if kids can do well, it puts them in further contention for the conversation of the sophistication point. Because in reading anchor papers, a lot of anchor papers that the College Board puts out, and being a reader for the exam, I don't see kids do that very often across the nation. And it's not hard, but it just needs to be taught. So we quoted, and that quote is linked to the first promise of the first premise. So now we got to analyze it. Perhaps part and parcel of the human condition, it is common to tussle with the inert restlessness that compels one to want to become more than the limited self. Mankind, at least some are led to believe, is endowed with an infinite smallness that mocks the folly of desire and the folly of withdrawal. So you can see there are small quotes, right? Just chuck it in the fabric of the sentence. You quote, you got to analyze, right? Make sure everything you promised in the first premise is coming to fruition here in the second. You got to quote and or paraphrase for all those promises. Even in trying to escape the natural world, and even through the maddening desperation of wanting things to be different, one often finds themselves frustratingly ruminating the if only she could of life's glass ceiling. Ostricker juxtaposes this human tendency to that red tree, the one that burst into fire all this week. Taking the form of an extended metaphor, this tree comes to symbolize man's natural instinct to want to transcend the shackles of our limited natures. Like the majestic tree, the narrator wants to be making love, be making poetry, be exploding. But as I said before, you cannot end a syllogism on a quote. We got to go and conclude the thought. We got to go back to the first premise, the promise, and the prompt and the thesis. So look at the quick conclusion. Conclusions of syllogisms usually take like 2, no more than 3 sentences. This beingness, at least in the first chapter, is capped according to the narrator. It's as if the natural world, maybe even God, is taunting mankind with the constant reminder of man's meekness. But, perhaps ironically, the wisdom to know differently can only come with age. So again, if you are writing with me, good place to pause, give it a whirl. Try that out. First premise, 3 sentences, get a focus on the terms, devices, techniques up top at the poem. Go methodically through it. Make sure all your quotes and paraphrases are germane to the promise of that first premise. And then shoot for 10 to 12 sentences. Use that 5-word rule for your embedded quotes, and things should be pretty good. But that's only an intro and a body. What do we do next? Because Mr. Kuhn said this is a 4-paragraph essay. You bust out another syllogism, and basically you got to ask yourself what's left. Well, in terms of my paper, I pretty much only analyzed the first chapter. I still got chapters 2 and 3 left to do, and there's a ton of stuff in there. I haven't gotten to the setting yet. I haven't gotten to much of the imagery. I haven't even touched upon the syntax of the poem. So I got a lot to do in that remaining paragraph. So again, you just front load that first premise with the terms, devices, techniques that you want to focus on. Go hunting for the quotes and paraphrases, 10 to 12 sentences. And then let's talk about wrapping the essay up. So we know that we need a conclusion paragraph, and just for quick overview here, I tell my students this for conclusions, and especially early in the academic year. Ultimately, I want them off these stems because they're kind of generic, but they work early in the year as a training wheel or as a scaffold. A conclusion is kind of like seeing the grand finale of a fireworks display. Heavy emphasis on theme, right? So you're closing with big universal truth, exigence. So any of these work. So simply said, evidentially, in no other words, when it's all said and done at the end of the day, in a global sense. So those just get the kids running, and then conclusion paragraph, typically 3-4 sentences. All right, my friends, happy teaching, happy writing. Note that if you want to reach out to me, I have an email address, teachingwritingcoach@gmail.com. I love hearing from teachers and students. If you got questions, don't hesitate, send them my way. Even if you have a suggestion for a writing workshop idea, send that my way. So I always love hearing from teachers and students. Note that I'm a lead teacher for the National Writing Project. We have professional development all year long. Most of it's free, some's for a nominal fee. I present with NCTE quite a bit. Perfection learning, applied practice. So if you want to stay abreast of my comings and goings, www.teachinghowtowrite.com. You can find my calendar there and see what's on docket. So students, if you're watching this, note that I own my own tutoring company. I call it Write at Ivy Write. I did all of my graduate work through Ivy League schools, even worked admissions at Brown back in the day. So especially come college application season, if you want a little extra help with your personal statements and supplements and that pesky application process, drop me a line and we can talk shop and we can see if we're a good fit for each other. I've also been teaching Lang and Lit for over 2 decades. Got it pretty well down, and if you're looking to clear that hump successfully, I'll help you out with that. So that's it. I'll come at you with more writing workshops in the coming days, weeks, months, and years. I love doing this, and thank you for being an attentive audience. Take care.